Listening Library presents Beauty and the Beast, adapted by Elizabeth Rudnick, read for you by Jenna Augen.
As all fairy tales do, this story begins with the simplest of words, once upon a time. But that is where our story, a different type of fairy tale, takes a turn. For this is not just the tale of a beautiful maiden and a handsome prince, although in truth the lady is lovely and the prince can indeed be charming. This is a tale of a beauty much deeper than that. It is the story of two people drawn together under the most interesting of circumstances. Two people who learn to truly see what matters only after they meet each other, and their tale, one both as old as time and as fresh as a rose, begins. So, our story starts, once upon a time, in the hidden heart of France. Prologue. The prince scowled. He faced a pair of heavy gilded doors that were shut to him. From beyond, he could hear music and laughter. The party, his party, had already begun. Crystal clinked as guests toasted the night and wandered about the ornate ballroom, their eyes no doubt widening as they took in the hundreds of priceless objects that lined the walls. Beautiful vases, detailed portraits of faraway places, rich tapestries, and solid gold serving plates were just a few of the many items, and they all paled in comparison to the beauty of the guests themselves. For the prince did not invite just anyone to his parties. He invited only those he deemed beautiful enough to be in his presence. So they came from all over the world, each one as much on display as the inanimate objects in the room. Standing in front of the closed doors, the prince barely noticed the servants as they bustled about him, nervously putting the finishing touches on his costume. His majordomo hovered nearby, pocket watch in hand. The stuffy older man hated the prince's utter lack of respect for time. In turn, the prince took great pleasure in wasting the majordomos. A maid stood next to the prince, a feather brush in her hand. Gingerly, she painted a white line on the young man's face. The paint glided onto his smooth, flawless skin with ease. Finished, the maid pulled back her hand and cocked her head to the side as she took in her work. The mask had taken hours to paint, and it showed. It was exquisite. The prince's face had been transformed by the pale veil of paint. No detail had been spared, down to the faintest tracings of gold feathering and blue accents around his eyes, and the dusting of rouge that sharpened his already striking cheekbones. Matching the latest fashion, two beauty marks had been perfectly placed, one beneath his right eye and one above his crimson lips. Underneath the masquerade makeup, the prince's blue eyes shone coolly. Stepping back, the maid waited as the head valet draped a long jewelled coat over the prince's shoulders, and then carefully inspected it to make sure not one jewel was out of place. Satisfied, he nodded at the maid, who then dusted the prince's wig with powder. Then both bowed and waited with bated breath for the prince to act. Lifting one gloved hand, the prince gave a single haughty wave. Instantly a footman appeared. "More light," the prince ordered. "Yes, your highness," the footman said, turning and reaching for the candelabrum placed nearby. He lifted it so it illuminated the prince's face. The prince held a small mirror. It was silver with flourishes along the back and a delicate handle. In his large hands, the mirror looked tiny and incredibly fragile. Holding it up so he could see his face, the prince preened. He turned left, then right, then left again, before looking straight on at his reflection. He nodded once, and then, as though it were only a dish rag, the prince dropped the mirror. The maid, who had nearly fainted in relief at the prince's nod of approval, gasped as the mirror began to fall. Not even bothering to turn at the noise, the prince had the major domo open the doors to the ballroom. As he entered, the footman lunged forward, catching the mirror just before it hit the floor. The servants let out a collective sigh as the doors swung shut behind the prince. For the next few hours they would be able to relax, out of sight of their cruel, spoiled, and unkind master. Unaware of his servant's thoughts, or perhaps aware but unconcerned, the prince made his way across the ballroom. It was a sea of white, per his invitation. Many of the guests were hard to distinguish, save their masks. The result was enchanting. His mouth remained pulled down, however, and his solemn expression did not indicate any pleasure at seeing such beauty in his castle. He never allowed others to see if he felt joy or pain. It afforded him a sense of mystery, which he enjoyed immensely. As he walked, he heard the whispers of young women wondering excitedly if this would be the night he singled them out for a dance. A smug smile tugged at his lips, but he tamped it down and continued on his way. Pushing through a circle of eligible maidens and their chaperones, the prince arrived at his throne. It was raised above the ballroom floor, allowing him the best spot from which to view the party. Like everything else in the room, the throne was decadent in its design. A huge, majestic coat of arms dominated the seat, making it clear, if it weren't already, whose throne it was. Standing beside it, the prince turned and stared out at the ballroom. He watched a small, animated man sit at the grand harpsichord across the room. The prince locked eyes with the man, who smiled kindly in return, flashing teeth that had seen better days. The prince grimaced, but nodded. This was, after all, the premier Italian maestro. He and his wife, the elegant operatic diva who stood beside him, were known the world over for their sound. They were, simply put, the best. Because of that, the prince had needed to have them at his ball. With the prince's nod, the maestro began to play and the diva began to sing, her voice filling the ballroom. The prince strode out onto the floor and started to dance. His moves were smooth and practiced, honed from years of training. Around him, ladies moved in reverse to the prince, their dancing equally well practiced and smooth. Yet somehow they paled in comparison to him. His presence was bigger than the ballroom, his looks more beautiful, his coldness more chilling than the wind and rain that howled outside. The diva's voice had just swelled to an almost painful note when, suddenly, above the music and over the wind, the prince heard the unmistakable sound of someone knocking at the door that led out to the gardens. He lifted his hand, and the music came to an abrupt stop. The knock came again. For a moment, no one moved. And then all the windows blew open, followed by the door. Rain billowed into the ballroom, and a strong wind caused the candles in the sconces along the walls to flicker and go out. The ballroom was plunged into darkness, and the prince heard his guests begin to mutter nervously. In the remaining light from the candelabra on the tables, the prince watched with a mixture of anger and curiosity as a hooded figure entered through the open door. The stranger was hunched over, clutching a gnarled cane with a shaking hand. The visitor moved out of the cold and into the warmth of the ballroom. As the door shut, the hooded figure sighed audibly, clearly happy to be somewhere he, or she, seemed to think was safe and inviting. That couldn't have been more wrong. His initial shock fading, the prince felt rage well up inside him. Grabbing a candelabrum from a nearby table, he stormed through the crowd, pushing people out of his path. By the time he arrived at the door, his face was red, despite the layers of...
Sample complete. Ready to continue?